Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined this session on mounting political violence in America and what it means for Asia, Europe, and the world. The session is being jointly organized by the University of Chicago Global Centers at Hong Kong, Beijing, and Delhi. And to do this session, we have none other than Professor Robert Pape. Many of you know Professor, but it is my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Robert Pape and his work to all of you. Professor Pape is a professor in political science at the University of Chicago, specializing in international security affairs. His research interests span across international relations, international theory, national security affairs, international terrorism, and American political violence. He has numerous publications across renowned journals, as well as a range of books that his publications include Cutting the Fuse, The Explosion of Global Suicide Terrorism, and How to Stop It. Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, which is a publication of Random House in 2005, and Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War, which is a Cornell publication in 1996. His commentary on national and international security policy has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, New Republic, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, and the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences, as well as on The Face of Nation, The Whole Story with Anderson Cooper, ABC News, CBC News, CNN, Fox News, and National Public Radio. Before coming to Chicago in 1999, he taught international relations at Dartmouth College for 5 years and air power strategy for the USAF School of Advanced Air Power Studies for 3 years. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1988 and graduated summa cum laude and the Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Pittsburgh in 1982. His current work focuses on the causes of suicide terrorism and the politics of unpolarity. He's the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Given the global rise of political violence, America is experiencing mounting political violence that is crossing thresholds after threshold of restraint in the use of political violence, from riots during George Floyd's protests in 2020 to the storming of US Capitol in 2021 to violent protests on college campuses to assassination attempts against Speaker of the House Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and now to the cold-blooded murder of prominent healthcare CEO. The issue needs immediate attention. In today's lecture, Professor Robert Pape will explain the major factors driving today's era of violent populism in America and how it compares to past US eras of political violence and what it portends for instability in geopolitical contexts in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. So we couldn't have thought of a better way to start today's webinar in this situation with Professor Robert Pape. Welcome to the session, Robert, and over to you now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lenny, for that tremendous introduction. I want to say thank you to the Delhi Center, the Beijing Center, the Hong Kong Center for putting this event together. It's a great privilege to talk to so much of the world. 2025 is going to be quite a momentous year. It's going to be a momentous year in the United States. It's going to be very likely a momentous year for the world. And so the opportunity to share my thoughts on this and then to hear your questions and reactions is really just tremendous. Now, as we start off, I'm going to, I think, screen share. So I just need confirmation. I should go ahead and share my screen at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Lenny, you might be able to just give me a thumbs up of some kind that you can see the screen. That would be extremely helpful. So I'm going to, yes. Oh, great. Terrific. And so what I'm going to do over the next 45 minutes is I'm going to lay out my views about what's coming. And then I very much look forward to your questions as we go forward. One second. So this is a precarious moment for democracy, not just in the United States, but around the world. Since 1990, the United States has been a superpower facing choices for intervention with little domestic constraint. That is now changing. The United States is becoming what I call a domestically constrained superpower. The key reason is mounting political violence in America itself and those underlying reasons why that's happening, which I'll explain. And these are not likely to go away anytime soon. The election of Donald Trump is not changing this. Indeed, as you'll see, the second Trump administration is likely to increase domestic instability in the United States and make international instability more challenging, not just for the United States, but for Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Now, as you heard in the introduction, I've been studying political violence for 30 years. For many decades, I focused on coercive air power, economic sanctions, international terrorism, and propaganda. As you heard, I spent years teaching for the U.S. Air Force before coming to the University of Chicago, so I know quite a bit about the military issues. In fact, I just gave a talk to the U.S. Air Force a few weeks ago, so I still am deeply engaged with our military. But for the last 4 years, I've been focusing on a new project, adding on to the old, which is political violence in America itself. I've conducted detailed studies of the George Floyd protests, 5 to 7% of which were riots. That's over 5 to 700 events across 100 American cities. I've studied every person that's been charged for the January 6th insurrection. I've done quarterly surveys of support for political violence in the United States since the summer of 2021, and you'll see the most recent was just a couple months ago. I've studied our U.S. military veterans and extremism. I've done focus groups. All of this has been with an effort to get a deep understanding of the dangers to American democracy. And I'm going to share that with you today, but then also talk about the implications for Asia and the world. Now, I'm not just a scholar who publishes in peer-reviewed publications, although I do that. I've had a number of publications just this year. But I also do work where I advise, I don't mean paid consulting, but I advise policymakers various ways. I've advised every White House since 2001. I've advised a whole range of others, including international leaders who are on the bottom tier. You'll see New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern. I was part of the civilian component of the Christchurch call that she organized in Paris in 2019. You'll also notice on the far left, those of you who follow Taiwan, President Chen of Taiwan. In 2003, President Chen brought me to Taiwan as one of just a handful of air power experts to be part of a 2-day conference to advise what Taiwan should do if China preemptively attacks Taiwan while the United States was preemptively attacking Iraq. And so the last time I was in Taiwan was June 2019. There, as the Beijing Center knows, there was a period of time from 2012 to 15 when I was going to China practically every 2 or 3 months. So I wouldn't call myself an Asian security expert in that way. However, I have quite more than just a passing familiarity with the national security issues related to Asia. Now, the topics today, I'm going to focus on America's extraordinary era of what I call violent populism. That's the term I give to it. I'm going to also tell you a bit about our centers. That's the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats. That's the center I direct, our national surveys on political violence. I'm going to help you understand why this era of violent populism is happening now. Then I'll talk about the impact of Trump's reelection and then the risk for stability in Asia, especially focusing on China and Taiwan. And then I'm glad to talk about Europe and the Middle East in the Q&A. Now, today's era of violent populism is characterized first and foremost by historically high political violence on both the right and the left in the United States. And let me explain what I mean. First, let me talk about assassination attempts against Democratic leaders. So in October 2022, there was a famous assassination attempt against Nancy Pelosi, missed her, that's Speaker of the House, missed her, but almost killed her husband. Then, 6 months after, about 9 months after that, there was an assailant with guns and other explosive equipment in his vehicle who was surveilling ways to get into former President Barack Obama's home. Fortunately, he was arrested before he could do any harm. We've also, of course, had most recently the two most famous assassination attempts, which are assassination attempts against Donald Trump. I assume you're familiar with these. This is quite extraordinary. And just a few weeks ago, this has expanded still further to a threshold-breaking event of assassination of a CEO, and this is now for social justice, not because the individual was disgruntled with particular service he was denied or so forth for himself. And this has received support by tens of millions of Americans. Really quite an extraordinary thing that's happened. And also just literally less than 2 weeks ago on New Year's Day in the morning, we had a suicide martyr, that is an individual who put together a car bomb and blew himself up in the car bomb, much the way Buddhist monks killed themselves during the Vietnam War to protest the Vietnam War. Except in this particular case, what he was trying to call attention to was he was calling for people to fight to get the Democrats out of the federal government. He left a detailed memo explaining his motives. And so this is all quite extraordinary. Now, this set of assassinations and other events that I'm describing, we haven't seen anything like this in the United States as a cluster since 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. This really quite an extraordinary period of time. Over 50 years, we haven't seen this kind of cluster of events, but there's more. Many people have been asking, well, wait a minute, are these just sort of one-offs? Are these randomly clustered events? Well, at CPOST, we tried to answer that question by studying this in a systematic way. And we chose to study rising threats to members of Congress going back over 20 years. This gives us a systematic data set, so to speak. And so we started in 2001. We looked for every threat to a member of Congress, the Supreme Court, the cabinet, president, vice president, starting in 2001, going to the end of 2023. And then we studied what's happening here systematically over time in the United States. And we found a tremendous discovery, which is that threats to Congress in particular rose fivefold. Starting with the first year of the Trump presidency, and that has continued to remain high all the way through the first years of the Biden presidency. And we will be updating this study over the next few months to capture 2024, which we believe will continue to show this pattern. Who's being targeted? Both Republicans and Democrats. It's not true. It's just hitting one side. Both Republicans and Democrats are being targeted here, almost 50-50. And you can also see this if we go to the details. See, all this information is public. It's not been aggregated before, but it is public. And so we go through the court documents. We are collecting this. These are threats that have risen to the point where the Department of Justice has prosecuted the perpetrator. So we have a clear threshold, and you can really see that we really are in a violent era in American politics on a systematic basis. Well, in addition to that, we've also seen violent political protests over the last several years in the United States, on top of everything else I've shown you. In 2020, we saw the George Floyd riots. Now, most of these, of course, the George Floyd protests were peaceful, but about 7% were riots. And these were really amazing riots because you saw vicious attacks against the police and police stations and police cars across a whole range of cities, including in my own city, Chicago. Also, then we saw January 6th. January 6th was probably the most famous domestic event of political violence in the United States, certainly since the Civil War. Here you had thousands of Trump supporters storming the Capitol in order to stop the certification of the election for the duly elected President Joe Biden. And that continued for hours, got Congress to flee because they were terrified for their lives. And they did come back, but this was a case where we didn't know they were going to come back. And fortunately, President Trump told his people to go home, or they may not have gone home. We also saw in 2023 and 24 a whole range of political, essentially riots on college campuses. Now, there were some peaceful protests, of course, many peaceful protests too, but we saw a range of riots on college campuses where we saw essentially violent protesters storming Jewish buildings, all kinds of other events that are happening across a range of college campuses in the United States, not just in one cluster, but in multiple clusters. So why is all of this happening? This is what I call the era of violent populism. You'd have to go back to the 1960s to find anything like this in American history, this kind of cluster of events. And why is this happening? Very important question. Well, the first thing I want you to understand is that political violence has patterns, and there's a good analogy that I think you should understand, which is I call it the wildfire analogy, which is that political violence is typically the product of some combustible material, like the kindling that could be set off in a wildfire, and then unpredictable triggers. The unpredictable triggers in a wildfire are campfires left unattended, cigar butts, sparks flying in backyards. That's what appeared to happen in California in the last few days. Those are unpredictable. But what you can predict and you can study is the combustible material. You can see the range of it, you can measure it, you can understand it. That is really important for political violence, and that's our window into studying this problem systematically. Now, what that means for the violent perpetrators themselves is also very important, because you see, the political violence, the kindling that matters is support for political violence in the United States. And the more there's public support for political violence, the more you're likely to get political violence itself. And that's because when you have public support for political violence, volatile people who are volatile for their own psychosocial reasons come to believe that their violence will be popular, and that tends to nudge them to take the actual step of violence. So this is not a situation where mental illness and other reasons are alternative explanations to political violence. They're reinforcing explanations. And this is important because the news media, of course, doesn't really, they're not scholars studying this, so they don't tend to understand how these different factors fit together into a coherent whole. But that's why it's so important to study public support for political violence, because that tends to give us our best canary in the coal mine. Now, we at CPOS then track public support for political violence, and we do this with highly reliable, nationally representative surveys. I'm glad to tell you the details of how the polling is done and how we do this as a probability sample of a nationally representative sample. So all glad to explain that, but this is the best in the world. This is the gold standard, and it's done with NORC at the University of Chicago. And it really is a great window, as you're going to see, into political violence. But it's also very expensive. Anyone wanting to contribute, but it's very expensive. This is not $5,000. It's not a few undergrads dialing over the phone on the weekends or something. This is the stuff that really is expensive, much better than the typical polls you tend to see. And they have impressive margins of error here, so that we can really get at what we're trying to measure. Now, the key finding that we found in our polls recently has been that there is support for political violence, that is the use of force, both against Donald Trump to prevent him from becoming president and for Donald Trump to restore him to the White House. That is, Trump is a lightning rod who is causing political violence both for him and against him. So this is not just one side or the other. So specifically in our September poll, we found that 5.8% of the American public, which equates to 15 million American adults, agreed that the use of force is justified to restore Donald Trump to the presidency. And 8.2%, that equates to 21 million adults, agrees that preventing Trump from the use of force justified to prevent Trump from becoming president. And just think about how then this relates to those events that I talked about before. Why would you do a spectacular martyrdom operation to blow yourself up in a spectacular way, thinking this was going to egg on aggressive steps against Democrats? This is the basis source. They may not know the polls, but these actors have perceived confidence that their actions are going to be popular. And that is what's driving this. And that's why it's helpful to see that there is unfortunately strong support for political violence that has seeped into the mainstream of America. This is not the case that we're dealing with just like a half of 1% or a third of 1% who might be Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, or so forth. This is a much bigger problem in the United States in the last 6 years. And that's why, even though we've had militia groups in the United States for decades and decades, now we're having major waves of political violence, and this has a lot, and you'll see we'll build on this even more. Now, we can drill into this. We can show you that I call these the half moons, that the folks that are supporting violence to prevent Trump, there's also a large number who are ambivalent here, which could be nudged to become even more supportive of violence. That, of course, is very worrisome, not just the red. Then we can also show you, we ask questions about what sort of access to tools, organizational tools, what sort of political activity do they have? Well, you can see that this group is more dangerous and active and has growth potential than we'd like to believe. Many of them already own guns. We also drilled in to do separate analyses where we said, well, let's really understand what folks mean by the use of force, because everybody asks, well, maybe they just mean yelling or screaming or something. They don't really mean they're going to hurt anybody. Well, we did separate studies with text boxes where we asked people more directly, when you agree to X, Y, or Z, what do you mean? And here we're focusing on the group that agrees use of force to prevent Trump from becoming president, and 36% of those mean that it's assassinating Trump and killing him, as they say directly in the words. Others are talking about more collective forms of military action against Trump. Well, this is not all of that 21 million, but it's really quite a large fraction of them. So this is just giving you a sense that this is just really how virulent the problem is in the United States. Now, there's also support for political violence on the right. We can do the same sort of thing. We can show you the half moons, and you can see that the problem here is not just limited to the red. We also have to worry about the ambivalent and the blue. We can also show you how active, dangerous, and their growth potential, and this too is quite concerning. Same patterns you're seeing here. And then we can track this over time. And you can see that there's violent support for Trump here. And you can see that it's kind of stayed moved up after the first federal indictment, after declining for almost 2 solid years. The federal indictments of Trump, the trials, actually pushed violent support for Trump back up for the first time in 2 years. And they pretty much stayed that way within the margin of error through September 2024. And then we can also look at violent support against Trump here. And you can see that there was also pretty much a flat up here until the first assassination attempt, and then a slight downward decline. I'll explain more a little bit about that. That's still within the margin of error, although just barely so, but I'll explaining more about that change over time. But you can see these are pretty high numbers here, even when there's that decline. And we can also study this by where that public support is and the demographics of that public support. And basically what you see is this is not white rural rage. This is not happening just in people who are really poor. This is happening in urban areas. This support is happening in suburban areas. It's happening among college-educated, middle-aged. This is in the core mainstream of America, not just on the fringe. And I'm not going through all that data here, we just don't have time. Now, the root causes of violent populism, what accounts for this? Is it polarization, social media, Trump, something else? All of these causes matter, but I'm going to show you there's an overriding source for conflict that the common explanations overlook, and that's demographic change. The big thing that's happening in the United States is we are going through a historic shift for the first time in our 250-year history from a white majority democracy where we're heavily a majority, almost 90% white population in 1970, to now a white minority democracy and a genuinely multiracial democracy, and we're right at the tipping point. Today, that number is around 61%. As we go forward over the next 10 years, you'll see that tipping point. We will cross the tipping point. But this, I believe, is the key source of the problems that we face in our volatile politics and in our violent populism. So we can also look at the demographic change over time, and you can see that we are coming through that core tipping point era here. And it's a little hard to predict because these numbers really do depend on immigration. They really do depend on deportations, which is why that issue, not just Donald Trump, rose in a meteoric way in 2015, but he rode the wave of immigration in 2015. That's what made Donald Trump, the famous meteoric candidate. And it's because what's happening is there's a lot of reaction here on the right, where there are folks who don't necessarily want this demographic change to occur. However, that's provoking backlash on the left, where there are folks on the left who are worried that, well, maybe that demographic change will be stopped, or maybe it should even accelerate so that it doesn't stop. Now you're getting this spiral of violence on both the right and the left, all fundamentally around this core issue. And you can see this in our surveys, because we can actually correlate support for political violence in our surveys with these demographic change issues. So on the right, we can see that the more you believe in what's called the Great Replacement, this is a right-wing theory that says that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate with new, more obedient voters from the third world. The more you agree that the Democratic Party is deliberately causing that demographic change in the United States, you are 7 times more likely to support violence for Trump. This is a core predictor of that. Now, on the left, we don't have, oops, one second. On the left, we don't have a perfect mirror image of the Great Replacement idea, but we have something that comes close, which is systemic racism. And we found that the more you agree America is a systemically racist and against non-white people, and always has been, the more you agree with that proposition, you are 3 times more likely to support the use of force to prevent Trump from the White House. So you can see there's really strong reasons to believe that this issue of demographic change is an underlying core structural factor. And that's important because that means that this issue of violent populism, this is not going away, folks, anytime soon in America. In fact, it could well get worse, as you're going to see. And that is likely to happen through 2035, 2038, 2040. It's a little hard to know exactly where, but this is going to consume a lot of American politics and attention in really severe and intense ways. Now, the election of Donald Trump also corresponds to America's historic demographic shift. And let me show you what I mean. Donald Trump, as we all now know, gained a tremendously wide victory. And these arrows show you at a granular level where the vote margin tilted toward Trump across the country compared to the 2020 election. And you can see all the red arrows across so much of the country. And the only reason California and Washington are there is because this snapshot was taken before their votes were in. You would also see the same thing there. It's just a broad thing happening. But what's also underneath that? Well, we now know from from the exit poll data here that Trump won support from the working class across the board. And this is really quite striking because Democrats are supposed to be the party of the working class. But if you made $100,000 or less, you were much more likely to vote for Donald Trump than Kamala Harris. It's actually those who made over 100,000 who were going to vote for Kamala Harris. And that's really quite a striking reversal in American politics. And then race, 33% of the population that was non-white voted for Donald Trump. And let's drill into that. And you can see that the biggest factor there, let me just move this over in case you can't quite see it. The biggest factor there was the Hispanic vote. It was the big Hispanic vote that really voted for Donald Trump. And this was also a major change. Because if you compare this over time in 2016 and 2020, you can see that there is a massive swing toward Donald Trump among Hispanic men, and even not quite as massive, but a massive shift among women for Donald Trump. And much of this is happening because these are the most religious those who go to the Hispanics who go to the church the most. That is, this isn't just class, this is also religion that was extremement important. So essentially what happened is Donald Trump gained a new multiracial coalition here among people who were very happy with the current racial balance in the United States, even if they're not white. And that's very important to understand, that as we go forward, this is going to be an amazing contest here, where it's not clear that as America becomes a more multiracial democracy, that will lead to a progressive future for the United States. Many Democrats have assumed that would be the case. This is now much, much more turbulent here. And this is going to add to the turbulence of our politics going forward. Now, we didn't see election violence in November here. And why didn't that happen? Well, we can analyze why that didn't happen in the near term, but then we'll see what this means over time. And since Trump won, it's easy to see why there was no political violence occurring among Trump supporters. The big question is, why no violence among Harris supporters? And you'll see that the key factors are that for the first time in our polling in a year and a half, there was an amazing decline in support for violence against Trump compared to the pre-election surveys. And a big part of the reason for that was the calming rhetoric by Harris and Biden, that is, Harris, the candidate, and President Biden, and their commitment to the peaceful transfer of power. In other words, rather than touching off, being triggers to ignite the kindling of political violence here, they poured water on those embers. And that was a very important reason. Now you can see the change here in support for political violence, and you can see that it dipped. And this poll was done November 8 to 12, and you can see that it's dipping about a week after the election, and it's dipping strongly for the first time in years here. Well, why? And that means the kindling is going way down. But it's more than that. You can also see this across all the swing states, that the same pattern, we did the poll to cover even specific swing states, and you can see that same pattern occurring there in the major swing states. Why? Harris, after especially the second Trump assassination attempt, began to very publicly denounce political violence against Trump. That means she's criticizing essentially many of her own constituents. This doesn't happen very much in politics, but she did the noble thing, and that helped to tamp this down. Also, Joe Biden famously is shaking Trump's hand after the election. This is the not just verbal commitment to the peaceful transfer of power, but literally showing this in the Oval Office itself. This very powerful water, calming water, being poured on those embers. But it's not all good news, I'm sorry to say. Those very same exit poll data are showing that even after Trump's victory, many Democrats are concerned and many are scared of what is coming down the road. We're also seeing that threat to democracy, both Republicans and Democrats continue to see the other as the main threat to democracy. That's not going away. We're not coming to a unity period in American politics. Everybody's not going to just suddenly, it's not suddenly all deciding, oh yes, we're going to abandon the old and now we're going forward. We're a very divided country, and that's staying that way. What's the biggest issue here that we face? The biggest issue that we face is immigration and deportation. Those who voted for Trump, nearly all of them support mass deportation. That is, most should be thrown out. That's millions and millions, not just a few 100,000. And most who voted for Harris are on the other side of that. Here, they don't want those deportations. Well, let's show you a little more about that deportation issue. We are now getting hard data on the numbers of illegal immigrants here in the United States, and it is in the many millions. And yes, there's different eras of time and so forth, but this great chart from the Washington Post shows you that of the over 4 million illegal migrants in the United States that are in the US court system, and there are many more that are not, you can see the vast majority came in under Biden. So this really is the big hunk. It's not simply confusion or something. And we can also see that they are heavily in the blue states and the Northeast. That is, they're in California, they're around Seattle and Portland, they're in Chicago and Minneapolis, my home area, big circles there. They're Denver, Colorado, they're New York City, they're in Boston. In the red states, they're in the bluest part of the red states in the urban areas. This is really, really going to require then, if we are going to have mass deportations, we are going to have to go into these blue areas. And this is going to be quite a destabilizing problem here. We don't know for sure how destabilizing, but this, I think we need to be aware. The United States has not done anything like this since the early 1950s, and even then, nothing this massive. This is going to be a big deal. So the bottom line is that things have been initially calm here, at least in November, although things have ticked up in the last few weeks. But the election portends more instability. Trump built a surprisingly strong multiracial coalition that was built mostly with Hispanic voters. This means it's not clearly a progressive future here. But the election is not reducing the fear of the other, and the large-scale deportations are likely to be destabilizing. There is more problems on the horizon. Trump has coming in with some major ideas for change, which are likely to be destabilizing. As you're undoubtedly noticing, he's already calling for greater control in North America, to expand America's orbit of control to include Greenland, Canada, down to Panama. Mexico, I'm sure, is terrified. And he's not ruling out military force to make and consolidate this control. And he's defining this as based on national security. This is a big deal. And even if we don't talk, even if there's no invasions happening in the near term here, we just need to understand this is a project which is going to consume much of America. If anything even gets off the ground, even 5 or 10%, this is going to be a consuming issue for America and the American military and Washington, D.C. On top of that, he's coming in with lots of promises and he's appointing the appointees to do it, to massively restructure and cut different parts of the government, the Defense Department, the State Department, the Department of Justice, the FBI, with generals, that is 3- and 4-star generals and admirals. He's talking about cutting them by a third. Well, this is Pacific Command on the right. And this is showing you those numbers of stars. I'm sorry, it's a little blurry, but you can see that if you're going to cut this by a third, how are you cutting it? How are you reorganizing? This is going to be a project, folks. This isn't a month project. This isn't like Elon Musk and Twitter. This is a command structured organization. You take a meat axe to this and you restructure this here. This is going to create a lot of confusion that's going to make protracted military operations difficult. Short-term operations, bombing runs, that's a different story. But protracted commitment, this is going to be a major challenge here as we go forward. This is what I mean by a constrained America. Now, what are the implications for Asia? Let me spend about next 7 minutes talking about that, and then we'll take your questions. So to do this, I really want to zero in on the issue of China and Taiwan, because that's going to be one of the hot issues here. And what I want to do is I don't want to just talk at you at a very high level. You could call this, give you the realities behind diplomacy and geopolitics, but I want to show you some of the nitty-gritty military issues here so that we can talk about what are the real military scenarios and what are the limits and so forth. And then how does America's growing domestic instability impact that? And the first thing I want to do is, first of all, I want to just zero in on China and Taiwan, that scenario where China, in this scenario, is taking or trying to control Taiwan. And the first thing I want to show you is this is a very hard problem. This is a very hard military problem. This is actually a much harder problem than Russia faced with Ukraine. The big reason here is because of the straits, because of that 110 miles. That is a tremendously more difficult challenge here for China in increasing its control of Taiwan than Putin ever faced with Ukraine. And you can see how difficult Ukraine has been. Now, why is Taiwan difficult? It's because it's an island. It also is because it has natural defensive advantages, mountains that I'm going to be showing you. And what that means is, at the bottom line is, any effort by China to literally conquer Taiwan will not be quick. There's no quick, decisive 3-week strategy here that shows that has much chance of success, even if the United States does not get involved at all militarily. And so even the most pessimistic war games that have been run by our military and those who are outside our military all would project that China would need, at a minimum, 2.5 to 3 months to literally conquer Taiwan, if it can do so at all militarily. And let me just explain what that means. So first, because China would have to cross water, this is essentially an amphibious operation, it's called. And we know a fair bit about amphibious operations. We know when they succeed and when they don't. And I'm just showing you the basic principles here. And in order to succeed, you need air superiority over the area in your target. You need initial superiority in troops at the point of attack. And you need superiority being able to reinforce and build up that initial troop advantage over time, so that the target, the defender, doesn't do so and kick you out. Well, where we've had historic successes in amphibious operations, all three of those principles have applied. However, all of those are in doubt with respect to the scenario of a possible Chinese attack on Taiwan. And let me just show you what that looks like. So first of all, in terms of standing forces, it's important to know that, yes, on a numerical basis, China has many more active troops and forces than Taiwan does, but that's not really the relevant operational issue. It's really about how many troops China can actually get on the island, which is a big deal, as you'll see. And then what does Taiwan have on the island itself? And notice Taiwan has massive number of active troops, but even at almost 10 times more reservist troops. This is a much more difficult nut to crack than it might appear for China. Now, the China landing zones are also extremely well known, and it's because of the nature of the mountains. So we know where these zones are. Yes, China could try to have a surprise in the mountains somewhere, but then they're stuck for weeks and weeks. And you see with Putin trying to do things that were just not militarily possible, they just don't work very well. So the bottom line is, we really do know where the key landing zones are. We also know where the points where China would have to come off the mainland. We know the marshaling areas on the mainland. That means there's no strategic surprise for this scenario. That means we'll see this coming months in advance. This scenario, you could say, well, wait a minute, I'm only focusing on the military ships from the China has. What about all the civilian and fishing ships? Well, they have no landing gear, so the troops would have to swim ashore. So all of the kind of additional scenarios you sometimes see in the news here really have all been taken into account. And the bottom line is that we really have studied this scenario for a long period of time, and we know quite a bit about what's likely to emerge and the different variants that could emerge. Now, the key thing to know is also that China's Navy, which would have to be deeply involved here, we've got several hundred total ships here, but this is not projected to change very much over the next 20 years. So yes, China's building more ships here, but the bottom line is this is very far away from anything that looks like the Normandy invasion in 1944 of 7,000 ships. So this is just not an easy thing here, and to simply build this large number of landing vessels and so forth. And it would take a long time for China to change these trajectories. So if you make some basic assumptions, which is China employs its entire fleet of about 300 ships, so we'll give them a few more ships, and we'll make assumptions about what Taiwan has to go after and attack those ships. And we'll actually even allow China to destroy half of all Taiwan's anti-shipping missiles. You can still see that even with modest assumptions here, Taiwan is likely to sink about a third of China's Navy just in the opening weeks here. And Taiwan is also stocking up on even more anti-ship missiles as we speak, as basically they should here, because this really is a key issue here for Taiwan. They should just be building more defensive missile capability, and they in fact are doing that, and they already have a substantial capability. Now, what about airborne scenarios? What about the idea that, well, they're just going to parachute in, China's going to parachute in? Well, yes, we can go through those scenarios. We can look at the transport ships here, the transport aircraft, which are highly vulnerable to missile attack. Here, these are big fat pieces of metal here. You basically would see that China would be lucky to land 5,000 to 8,000 on shore and have very, very difficult time reinforcing and resupplying these troops. And these would end up being extremely vulnerable. So this scenario isn't easy either. The real danger for Taiwan here is not this immediate several-month conquest of the island, although that is an issue. We have to keep up. They would have to keep up on it. The real issue is over a long-term blockade. That's a much more challenging problem for Taiwan here, and it's because of China, of Taiwan being much like Japan in World War II, highly vulnerable because it imports so much of its material. And also then, in this case, the missile coverage by China would be quite extreme here, making it very, very difficult for that to continue, especially without U.S. support. And what do I mean by that vulnerability? China imports 97% of its energy here. And this is not changing anytime soon here. And it also imports 65% of its food requirements here. And yes, there can be more fishing, but this is really going to be a challenging problem over a period of time. So the bottom lines are that the security of Taiwan hinges on prolonged U.S. economic and military support, not just what would happen in a very near-term scenario, but any prolonged U.S. commitment of this active sort is put at risk by U.S. domestic instability. Now, this does not guarantee that Trump will not act to defend Taiwan. I'm not making that case at all here, but it does mean that Trump's actions here are likely to be highly volatile. And this is not simply because of his personality and his style, which is volatile enough. This is because America is now a domestically constrained superpower, where those long-term plans to deal with problems in a longer-term way here are simply going to become less and less available because of our focus elsewhere on ourselves. Bottom line is the world is going to become a more dangerous place. So I'm sorry to leave you on a pessimistic note, but let me stop here and take your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Pape. Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Zenin Ge, Executive Director of the Center in Beijing. Thank you all for participate. The first three center organized the event for this academic year. So now it's my turn to moderate the question and answer portion of tonight's event. Here is how we're going to do this. Nani and I have consolidated some questions which are similar in nature, and we'll take turn to raise them to Professor Pape. The questions are corrected earlier through the online registration. and in real time as well when the talk was in session. So my first question is kind of like house cleaning type of question. Bob, you mentioned there is a mounting political violence. Yeah, we have quite a few questions concerning that. They'd like to know from historic perspective, what are the empirical evidence that we have so to justify the claim that there has been an increase in political violence in the U.S. politics. And you mentioned, we haven't seen this since 1968. You also presented some statistics by Nork. Do you have similar data to show the trend up until now?
So the most systematic evidence is the study we did on threats to members of Congress and other very senior federal officials. And the reason we had to do that is because assassination attempts, even of senior leaders, are by their very nature small in number. So if there's only one president of the United States, you can have 2 or 3 assassination attempts on that president. You could even kill the president, and still that would still be a random, could look like a random data point. So the fact is, I'm showing you the historical clustering of these assassination attempts against Speaker of the House, President of the United States, et cetera, and on both parties, that is Obama and also Donald Trump, and saying, well, you can't find anything like that cluster here unless you go back to 1968. But that's still not really systematic enough for, say, the University of Chicago, where we want still more systematic. And that's why we did the threats to members of Congress, because here we have a clear pool of individuals. Who has been a member of Congress in the period 2001 to 2023? It turns out it's about 1,700 people in that pool, by the way. And then we can also look at cabinet members and so forth as well. But the biggest pool is members of Congress. And then we can look at the numerator. That's the denominator. Then we can look at the numerator, and we can also look, and that numerator are the actual threats to that pool of people. By threat, I mean a threat that was serious enough that the perpetrator was prosecuted by the Department of Justice. So that's a clear threshold. So we can systematically track how is that, though, are those threats per year changing over time for this domain of individuals here? So we have a clear systematic approach to this that gives us our best systematic lens into it. And what you see is there's a little bit of ebbing and flowing from 2001 to 2015. We can explain why some of that is happening, but the real change up starts in 2017. And it stays up on an annual basis every year over 7 years. So that's a long period of time. Now, we haven't done 2024 yet, but we have no reason to think that's going to change because we have already started to do that. So it is at least, this is a very substantial piece of evidence that this is not simply randomness or so forth. There's something systematic happening. And those threats to members of Congress, much like I was showing you before, they occur against Democrats and Republicans. And the number one issue about why that blup up is happening to both Democrats and Republicans is their attitude toward Donald Trump. People are being attacked because they're supporting Trump too much. They're being attacked because they support Trump too little. So it's again, this is an exact fit with the overall picture that you are seeing here. So it's simply not the case that all this is random walk and all this is not. No, it's real. It's real. And we've just got to stop pretending as if this is all like, not really happening, but it's happening and it's not fading away.
Yeah, it is worrisome. So, and Nanny, what is your question?
Yeah, thank you, Zening. Professor Pape, thank you very much for this incredibly informative session, and the breadth of your analysis was phenomenal. Well, as a student of political science and international relations, I'm not only interested in the issue of political violence, but also want to understand the reason behind it. So do you think political violence is an overreaction to over democracy, is a reaction to over democracy? And do you think there are ways that we could address it?
I think that political violence here, this major kind of political violence, not small stuff, but the big stuff we're describing here, what I call violent populism occurring in democracies, is a function of social change. So what you are seeing as I'm explaining the origins here of the current era of violent populism in the United States is it is being caused by social change. And the big social change here is not that we become more or less democratic. The big social change is that we are going through a demographic transition from a white majority country to a white minority, generally multiracial country. And that is causing a lot of turbulence in our politics here. Now, there have been other eras of violent populism in the United States. The 1960s, I would also call an era of violent populism here. And what was underneath all of those riots that we saw in urban areas, and what was underneath the political assassinations I just laid out? Well, they weren't exactly the same type of social change, but it was social change. The 1960s were an era of massive social change. Massive social change on the cultural front here, massive change related to the Vietnam War, and massive change related to the civil rights movement. So we had massive degrees and dimensions of social change in the 1960s here, and that equated to clusters of violent assassinations, violence on our college campuses here, 4 dead in Ohio at Kent State. So that was our era, the previous era of violent populism. Then if we have to go back before that, it's the 1920s, especially 1920 to 1924, which saw the rise of what's called the Second Ku Klux Klan, the Second KKK, which rose from 1920 being about 200,000 members in the United States to by 1924, 6 million members in the United States. And that wasn't just in Georgia and so forth. That was in Indianapolis. That was across the Midwest. There are whole cottage industries of books by historians on the second KKK. So if your listeners want to know more about it, there's literally dozens of books describing this era here. This is the era of the Chicago race riot. I mean, there's a lot that happened during this era. And it wasn't just against Blacks, it was against Jews, it was against Catholics. And that was also an era of social change having to do with massive waves of immigrants after World War I. My grandfather, I'm Italian by extraction. My grandfather was an Italian Catholic who came to the United States in 1917 as an early part of this wave. Well, as these waves of Catholics were coming into the United States, and also as the great migration happened of Blacks moving into the northern cities to take jobs that the whites had left to go fight the war, you got massive social change in the United States, not just in the South. You got massive social change in the United States. And what that was doing was it was leading to the rise of the second KKK and lots of political violence supported by middle-class whites, basically Protestant whites, very, very much a product here. And then what ends that? That's when we decided a few years later to literally almost zero out immigration into the United States. So that famous set of cases where the Jewish community says, well, you wouldn't let the Jews in when the Nazis were killing them. That's true. And it's largely happens as a result of stopping this immigration. So we've been through 3 eras, with 2 previous eras of violent populism in the United States. We're in the 3rd era, and social change is what this is about. And this is why this is not going to be so easy. This is not solved by just electing the right politician. This is a much more challenging problem here than just simply, well, if this politician wins, we're good. If that one wins, we're good. No, we're going through social change in the United States, and that is not likely to end anytime soon. Even if Donald Trump deports 20 million non-whites, that trajectory is still going to happen. It would have to be bigger than that in order to stop this trajectory. This is a much bigger problem than I think most of the world has realized.
Thanks, Professor Pape. Yeah, I have consolidated quite a few questions along the same line. Basically, it's quite worrisome. People say, according to your data and the evidence to show in the U.S., because given the U.S. has been the beacon of democracy in the world, so even the U.S. domestically, we are seeing a mounting political violence. Absolutely, that's going to have a tremendous impact and implication to the rest of the world. And especially recently, there has been a right turn in political trend, like in Italy, France and Canada. We just saw the resignation of Trudeau. So given the rest of the world seems to be had a very profound political landscape change as well, does that mean we are entering a real worrisome a mounting political violence era like in the 60s?
I'm sorry to say yes. So I'm not here to sort of just make everybody feel good, I'm sorry to say. But here's the problem for the world besides, so inside the United States, we are seeing bit by bit, we're on the slippery slope of political violence where the norm of restraint in the use of force is being eroded bit by bit by bit. And now Donald Trump has come in, and what's the first new idea he has? Violence against our allies, Greenland, Canada, Panama. These are allies of the United States. Okay, so let's be clear. This isn't Iran or even China. We're talking about like allies of the United States. And what you're seeing is there's actually support for this that's happening, at least in the media. Now, maybe this will kind of, we'll get our, sort of more sensible, but this is part of what I'm explaining. The norms against the use of force are eroding. And so this is just becoming more acceptable. Well, unfortunately, if it becomes acceptable for the United States to think about coercing Denmark in some way to get Greenland, that's going to start to encourage other leaders and countries to think about becoming more coercive in their policies as well. Here, this is just how norms work. The norms here, one of the big issues we've had since World War II is America has been building norms against the use of force, both at home and abroad. And we explain that one of the reasons why it's important for the United States to defend countries that are just invaded out of the blue, even if there's all these reasons and so forth, is because the norm of the use of force, if you erode that norm and you allow force as the way to settle these disputes, well, now you're opening the door of a Pandora's box to a very dangerous world. And it's because there are over 200 countries in the world. There are parts of countries here. So if you start eroding the norms here, unfortunately, that slippery slope gets bad fast. And I believe that that's where we're emerging. I wouldn't say we're there yet. I would say this is the emerging problem that we are heading into for the next 10 years. And it's a problem here where up until now, America has been a source of stability and reinforcing norms against the use of force. If America starts to violate that norm itself, that is the biggest danger that we face here for stability in the world. And you're seeing this, literally in the weeks after Donald Trump has taken office. And it's not like you're seeing all this massive pushback here, even by the Democrats. They don't know what to say. So the problem is we are now on the slippery slope of political violence, and we're eroding the norms.
Thank you very much. Yes, Nanny.
Thank you, Zening. Professor, next question is slightly broader. And what we've seen that historically, whenever there is political violence, we see an attack on the civil liberties. Civil liberties are rolled back and stuff like that. So from your experience of researching, studying political violence across countries and having seen it for decades, do you have any view on this particular issue?
Well, I look at the United States in the near term. So much of what Donald Trump is talking about when he's changing the Department of Justice is putting in office Pam Bondi, Kash Patel on the head of the FBI, people who are famous for wanting to put Donald Trump's political enemies in jail. In fact, Kash Patel has published a book where he's listed 60 of them by name to put them in jail. So we're talking about violations of civil liberties here of those individuals in particular in ways that we just have not seen in the United States. Now, that has not happened yet, but simply the act of nominating and putting into play people who have this background, not just somewhere 25 years ago, but literally in the last months here, is also eroding that confidence in civil liberties inside the United States. So these are things we need to stop saying, well, this may not happen, or we don't have to worry yet because it hasn't happened yet. No, norms are ideas, and those norms are being eroded literally by Trump nominating those individuals here. And we don't know, once you're on the slippery slope here, this is, again, a slippery slope of erosion. There's no point where, it's okay because we haven't crossed this threshold yet. That's not how norm erosion works here. So a false confidence that people are saying, nothing to worry about here, not too bad yet, nothing's going to happen. It's just a mistake. And we already see that actors start to take matters into their own hands as these norms erode.
Thank you, Professor Pape. Well, considering the time, I still have quite a lot of questions. Actually, they have the common theme about the Sino-US relation under the new administration. I know this is going to open up quite a big, probably worth a lot of time for a lecture we should be focusing. So, but considering the time, we have to stop right here. So on behalf of the three centers here in Asia, I want to thank Professor Pape to give us the insights of the U.S. politics in this very early and cold Chicago morning. And thank everyone for joining us today. Have a great day and good night.
And I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who was involved. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.